Welcome to History Lost in Time, from one enthusiast to others. And welcome to the episode about Alfred Jodl. During World War II, he was chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht and later one of the defendants at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. This episode marks the beginning of a small series in which I will dedicate an episode to each of the defendants at this tribunal, but only the big trial at the beginning, not the smaller ones that followed. The order in which I will talk about the defendants is random, no judgment or hidden agenda. This episode has excess length, but I didn't want to split it since that wouldn't have made sense, so I just have to live with the fact that I put the work of 2 episodes into one. I hope you listeners can live with that as well. Why this topic today? I can imagine that some of you don't want to hear any more stories about the Nazis, or you don't like that I introduced Alfred Jodl as a defendant at Nuremberg. Well, all I can say is that National Socialism is a part of German history, and therefore part of this podcast. I will discuss the Weimar Republic and Imperial Germany as well, since I want to talk about all of the modern history of Germany. So why did I introduce Alfred Jodl as a defendant at Nuremberg? Well, there are many documentaries about him that focus on his Wehrmacht job. There isn't much that I could add to that. So I will discuss his career briefly, not in detail. What I can do is use the books that I have to highlight how people close to Jodl thought about him, and what Jodl himself said after the war. So this won't be a full profile about Jodl. If you expect that, you will be disappointed. But if you want to know what Jodl said about certain things, you may learn something new. Political background and commentary. This episode is not meant to either bash Germany for its Nazi past or to glorify National Socialism. The basis of good decisions is information. The basis of bad decisions is propaganda, whatever you call it. What I want to do is talk in a neutral and objective manner about Alfred Jodl and to add opinions about him and his own opinions. I will add my own personal commentary at the end of the episode. Other than that, there is no agenda or political goal behind this episode. The sources. My main source for his Wehrmacht career is Wikipedia, and I will use my book sources to confirm that. This shouldn't be a problem since his career isn't a controversial topic. I will use the following book sources. Walter Warlimont im Hauptquartier der Deutschen Wehrmacht 1939 bis 45. Translation at the Wehrmacht headquarters from 1939 to 1945, published by Weltbild Verlag, Augsburg, 1990. During the war, Walter Warlimont and Alfred Jodl closely worked together at the Wehrmacht High Command. Richard Overy, Verhöre, translation, interrogations, published by Verlag Propyläen Ullstein Heine List, München, 2002. In this book you can read about the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal and individual interrogations. Gustav M. Gilbert, Nürnberger Tagebuch, translation, Nuremberg Diary, published by Verlag Fischer, Frankfurt, 1962. Gustav Gilbert worked closely with the defendants as a psychologist during the trial in 1945 and 46 and talked to them individually and in groups. Albert Speer, Erinnerungen, translation, Memories, published by Verlag Ullstein, Frankfurt, Berlin, Wien, 1969. Albert Speer was Hitler's favorite architect and Minister of Armaments and also a defendant at the trial. Heinz Guderian, Erinnerungen eines Soldaten, translation, Memories of a Soldier, published by Motorbuch Verlag, Stuttgart, 2003. Guderian served as a general of the Tank Corps during World War II. Josef Goebbels Tagebücher, translation, Diaries, published by Ralf Georg Reuth, Verlag Pieper, München, 1992. Josef Goebbels was Minister of Propaganda in the Third Reich and wrote very detailed diaries. And finally, Henry Picker, Hitlers Tischgespräche im Führerhauptquartier, translation, Hitler's Table Conversations in the Führer's Headquarters, published by Verlag Ullstein, Frankfurt am Main, Berlin, 1993. Henry Picker, born in 1912, Nazi Party member since 1930, was a lawyer and worked at the Führer's headquarters as a law consultant since 1942. He was often a guest at Hitler's table. Let's start with a brief summary of Alfred Jodl's life and career. Jodl was born in 1890 in Würzburg. His father came from a Bavarian Austrian military family, which predetermined his path in life. In 1903, he joined a military school in Munich and joined the artillery corps of the Bavarian army in 1910. In 1913, he married Irma Pauline Caroline Countess of Bouillon, who died in April 1944. I can already reveal that he married Luise Katharina von Benda in April 1945, who lived until 1998. Both marriages were childless. In 1912, Jodl was promoted to second lieutenant. He participated in World War I right from the start at the Western Front and was already wounded in August 1914. For his service, he received the Iron Cross Second Class. He returned to the front lines in spring 1915. In 16, he was promoted to first lieutenant, and by the end of the year, he was transferred to the Eastern Front. In 1917, he took command of an Austrian artillery unit. In early 1918, he returned to the Western Front as a member of the General Staff. Later that year, he received the Iron Cross First Class. After the end of the war, he remained within the artillery corps of the army. In 1921, he was promoted to captain. In 1924, he briefly served at the Reichswehr Ministry, but was then transferred and served as a staff officer. In 1927 and 8, he was in charge of an artillery unit. From 28 to 32, he served as a teacher for tactics and war history. In 1932, he was promoted to major and returned to the Reichswehr Ministry. In 1935, he became head of the Department Home Defense in the Wehrmacht High Command. That same year, he was promoted to full colonel. In the aftermath of the Blomberg-Fritsch crisis of 1938, the entire leadership of the Wehrmacht was restructured. Jodl and his department were now directly answering to General Keitel, head of the Wehrmacht High Command. By the end of the year, Jodl left the High Command and became Chief of Artillery of the 44th Infantry Division and was promoted to Major General. In late August 1939, shortly before the outbreak of the war, he was ordered back to the High Command. He remained at this post for the entirety of the war and didn't command troops in the field again. At this point, we can interrupt the brief description of Jodl's career and add some opinions about him. On page 548 in the book Interrogations, General Guderian is quoted saying this at the Nuremberg trial about Jodl. General Jodl was a very conscientious and hard-working staff officer. He was a very reserved person. He mostly kept to himself and didn't have much contact to other people. He was also under the influence of Hitler. He kept his opinion to himself and only rarely opposed Hitler. This opinion about Jodl is basically shared by everyone. In his table Conversations with Hitler, Picker says the following about Jodl on page 316. Alfred Jodl, Hitler's most important military consultant, impressed us at the Führer's headquarters a lot because he didn't grovel in front of Hitler, but defended his own opinion with smart arguments and his natural Bavarian dialect. Jodl also stressed the need to adhere to the Geneva Convention and to improve conditions in the POW camps that housed Soviet prisoners. The point about the Geneva Conventions is confirmed by General Guderian in his book on page 388. Even in March 1945, Jodl was still arguing for them. Or maybe again, not still. After all, Jodl signed 2 criminal orders, which we will discuss later. Minister of Propaganda Goebbels also had a good working relationship with Jodl. In his memoirs dated December 4, 1940, page 1505, he wrote, "Discussed technical questions with General Jodl until very late. It's easy to work with him because he's very reliable." Albert Speer was a bit less flattering in his evaluation of Jodl. In his memoirs, he writes on page 258, "Colonel General Jodl also rarely opposed Hitler. He did this tactically. He usually kept his mouth shut, tried to evade difficult situations, and then later tried to change Hitler's mind or even cancel decisions that had been made by him earlier. Privately, he sometimes made snide comments about Hitler, which showed that he had kept a surprisingly objective mind about him. In private conversations, both Keitel and Jodl appeared to be tired, burned out." During the Nuremberg trial, Speer was a bit more direct. On page 240 in the Interrogations book, the following quote of Speer is written down. The military people surrounding Hitler were of weak character, just like the political people surrounding him. They could only survive if they had the same character trademarks, like submissiveness, that Hitler had forced upon his followers over all the years. Keitel, Jodl, Valimont, Winter, Buhle, Scherf were people like this. Zeitzler and Guderian tried to oppose him, so they both had to go. Let's return to Jodl's career. Jodl didn't have much to do with the invasion of Poland, as this was planned and organized by the Army High Command, OKH. However, the operations against Denmark and Norway, the Western Campaign and the Africa campaigns were managed by the Wehrmacht High Command, while the Army High Command took care of the Eastern Front. You may assume that the Wehrmacht High Command was in charge of all campaigns, as it was nominally the top instance of the Wehrmacht. However, that isn't accurate. The discussions in Walter Walimont's book clearly show that both Keitel and Jodl didn't have much to say when it came to the Eastern Front. Officers of the Army High Command did that. Following the victory over France, Jodl was promoted to General of the Artillery, and even though the Eastern Front was managed by the Army High Command, it was Jodl that worked out the invasion plan. That included the Commissar Order. This order stated that Soviet commissars were not to be treated as prisoners of war, but to be shot immediately by either SS, SD or Wehrmacht. In October 1942, Jodl signed the Commando Order, which stated that commando soldiers were not to be treated as prisoners of war, but to be shot directly. However, many frontline commanders did not follow that order. Jodl later claimed that he didn't really give that order, but only distributed it. So what was Jodl's function as chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht? In theory, he and General Keitel should have been in charge of all military operations of the war. However, that was never the case. On pages 63 and 65 of his book, General Valimont described both Keitel and Jodl as executive assistants of Hitler. Basically, they were better office personnel, transforming Hitler's spoken orders into written orders and distributing them. The operations were then handled by the Army, the Navy and the Luftwaffe. Albert Speer confirmed this in his memoirs on page 256. In theory, Jodl as chief of the operations staff should have coordinated all different theaters of war. But Hitler had assumed that function without fulfilling it, so basically Jodl didn't have a proper set of tasks assigned to him. Jodl basically said the same at the trial. In the interrogations book, the following conversation between the court and Jodl is written down on pages 272-273. Question: did Hitler make any military decisions during these briefings? Response: from day one. All decisions of any importance were made by him. During the summer offensive of 1942, Hitler and Jodl clashed with each other. Jodl considered the German forces to be too weak to attack both the Caucasus and Stalingrad. In the end, he turned out to be right, but Hitler accused him of sabotaging his efforts. Picker described that in his book on page 555. When Jodl returned without any results, Hitler was so horrified that he snapped at Jodl, saying that if he had just wanted to send his orders, he could have sent someone from the post office. When Jodl replied that Hitler himself was responsible for the difficult situation regarding the twin operations at Stalingrad and the Caucasus, their working relationship was damaged beyond repair. Hitler's voice was crackling when he shouted, "And how do you, Jodl, want to win this war without the oil from the Caucasus?" Albert Speer confirms these events in his memoirs on page 253. Their working relationship never fully recovered from this. However, from the outside, Jodl kept his composure and continued to work professionally with Hitler. On page 316 of his book, Picker claimed that Hitler never awarded Jodl with the Knight's Cross because of this. However, officially Jodl remained loyal to Hitler. In his book, General Guderian describes an incident from November 1943 in which he suggested to Jodl that Hitler should have a proper military commander-in-chief at his side. That way Hitler would be able to focus on politics again. According to Guderian, Jodl's reaction was like this: "And do you know a better commander-in-chief than Adolf Hitler?" His face didn't move and his entire attitude was one of icy rejection. In January 1943, Jodl received the Golden Party Badge of the Nazi Party. A year later, he was promoted to Colonel General. During the assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944, he suffered minor injuries. While Jodl was a hard-working and experienced officer, sometimes his predictions were utterly wrong. In October 1939, he was absolutely sure of total victory. Valimon quotes him in his book on page 62 with these words: "We will win this war even if this contradicts General Staff doctrine 100 times, because we have the better soldiers, the better equipment, better nerves, and a united, decisive leadership." In early October 1941, he considered the war against the Soviet Union to be won already. And his opinion regarding the invasion in Normandy was both really right and really wrong. In his diary, Goebbels reports on page 1992, February 25, 1944, the following: "Colonel General Jodl expects the invasion mainly in southern and northern France. In his opinion, an invasion in northern France is without hope. The English and Americans would be quickly defeated. However, our lines and fortifications in the south are a bit thin. He believes that the enemy will first attack the south, draw our forces there, and then start a large-scale invasion attempt in the north of France. He expects the decisive battle of the war happening there. Colonel General Jodl is rather optimistic regarding the future, even though he is a realist. His talk was of a high quality." When the invasion took place in a different fashion, Jodl remained optimistic and still believed that the Allies could be defeated, at least according to Goebbels, 24 hours after the invasion had started. In October 1944, Jodl ordered the complete deportation of the population of northern Norway during the evacuation of the German troops there. This order and its effects was considered a war crime and a crime against humanity at the Nuremberg trial. In his memoirs, Guderian describes several events in which his military suggestions were opposed by Jodl. Either Jodl didn't understand or he didn't want to understand. When it came to the estimates regarding the Soviet capabilities, Guderian relied on General Gehlen, who was head of the Enemy Armies East Department and after the war commanded the West German Intelligence Service. However, Hitler and Jodl didn't believe Gehlen and considered his estimates regarding Soviet capabilities to be massively exaggerated. According to Guderian, this caused Hitler and Jodl to distribute German forces incorrectly at the Eastern Front. Example: the counterattack in Hungary in spring 1945 with troops that Guderian had wanted for defensive purposes at the eastern border of Germany. In late April 1945, Jodl left Berlin and joined Admiral Dönitz in northern Germany. Both he and General Keitel commanded the German troops there in the final days of the war. On May 6, 1945, Dönitz awarded him the Knight's Cross. A day later, Jodl signed the surrender of the Wehrmacht. He remained at his post, heading the Wehrmacht High Command after Keitel had been arrested. On May 23, 1945, the remaining members of the German government were arrested. At Nuremberg, Jodl was charged with conspiracy against peace, participating to plan, prepare, launch and lead wars of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity. According to Gilbert on page 12, Jodl reacted very briefly when confronted with these charges. He said, "I regret the mix of justified indictments and political propaganda." Later, in a more in-depth conversation that Gilbert mentions on page 33, Jodl said, "The indictment was like a blow to my head. First of all, I had no idea about 90% of the accusations. These crimes are impossible to believe. Horrible if they are true. Second of all, I don't understand how the court can ignore the duty of a soldier to follow orders. That's the code that I have lived by my entire life. And third of all, the responsibility for crimes in the East is upside down. How is it possible that the Russians are judging us when it comes to cruelty against the local population? And furthermore, it is claimed that we personally enriched ourselves by pillaging our victims. I am speechless. If you have to, accuse me of giving the orders for the campaigns against Holland, Belgium, Norway and Poland. But don't accuse me of profiteering at all from these actions. I was always alienated when I saw how party leaders profiteered from our victories. I was and always have been a general. These horrible events, they are totally unbelievable to me. I just don't understand what sort of beasts were responsible for these camps and how they could have done these things." Here we can see how Jodl set up his defense, the principle I was only following orders. However, the court didn't accept this, and this was never a proper argument anyway. Germany signed the Hague Convention of 1899, the basis of the international law on warfare, and thereby had a duty to follow the rules of war, including the treatment of enemy soldiers and civilian populations. Following orders or giving orders that violated these duties was never legal. During the trial, Jodl was confronted with the crimes of Nazi politicians. When the movie about the concentration camps was shown, he was shocked and claimed no knowledge of this. However, later he admitted that he knew about the deportation of Danish Jews and about atrocities during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. When the truth about the Röhm coup was revealed, he lost his temper during a break. While talking to other defendants, he started shouting. Gilbert describes this on page 284 of his book. One pigsty was worse than the other, an infamy against all decent people that took part in this pigsty and believed in it. According to Gilbert, he had totally lost his temper and was shouting across the room. Frick replied coolly, "That may be true, but I believe no coup was planned, and that one gang just liquidated the other." Jodl, still angry, "What's that supposed to mean? No coup? And we had to sit in our office with the pistols on our desk. A miserable pigsty. That's what this was, on both sides." After he had calmed down later, he talked with Gilbert about his outburst. Gilbert quotes him on page 292. "Yes, it is bitter and no fun to be torn apart by the disgust about these dirty events and the natural patriotic feelings that still remain within me. When more details regarding the concentration camps were revealed, for example the usage of dental gold, he reacted with loathing. In his defense, he tried to draw a line between clean soldiers and dirty politicians. He claimed that officers never personally profiteered from the war. His positive opinion regarding Hitler that he still had at the beginning of the trial seemed to change the longer the trial went on. He started stressing that he had opposed Hitler on certain issues and that he had even hated him. Gilbert quotes him on page 352 saying this, "I hated Hitler because of his contempt for the bourgeoisie, which I am part of, because of his distrust and his disdain for the nobility, which I was connected to due to my marriage, and because of his distrust and his hatred for the General Staff, which I was a part of." According to Jodl, Hitler hated these groups for different reasons. He considered the bourgeoisie to be cowardly and not really open to his revolutionary ideas. The nobility was too cosmopolitan for him, and he found their manners to be alien, and the General Staff was blamed for everything by Hitler at the end. Gilbert continues to quote Jodl on page 365. "Knowing everything now that Hitler and Goebbels are responsible for, it's no surprise that they insisted on continuing to fight. I understand now. They knew that they would hang no matter what, so they decided to kill themselves at the end of the war. Under these circumstances, it's easy to order all others to continue fighting and marching into total annihilation. I understand that clearly now." Another quote, "After the successful invasion in France, it was time to end this, at the latest. The war was lost after Stalingrad." Who did Jodl blame for the war? Only Hitler. In that regard, he followed a pattern that most defendants used, blaming those that weren't there, Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels. However, Jodl had a few arguments on his side due to his personal history. On pages 358, 63, and 64, Gilbert quotes him, "You can be assured we generals didn't want a war. Us veterans of World War I, we really were fed up. There's only one person responsible for this, just one, Adolf Hitler." Quote, Jodl repeated that there was no doubt that Hitler started the war with full intention. He was puzzled that nobody asked about this during the cross-examination. However, in the interrogations book, a document is mentioned on page 204 in which Jodl praised Hitler as a great military leader. According to him, Germany only lost the war because of the failures of the Luftwaffe, an opinion that Hitler shared. However, during the cross-examination, he backpedaled a little. On pages 272 and 73, the following dialogue is mentioned. Question: "Do you think Hitler's decisions were good and responsible for the initial successes in the war?" Answer: "I can't say that this generally. There was no doubt that many of the important decisions that the Führer made prevented an earlier defeat in the war." Question: were there any military decisions of Hitler that you considered to be wrong from your viewpoint as a soldier? Answer: not at the beginning of the war. However, in 1942, during the summer offensive in Russia, my personal opinion was that the Führer made unreasonable decisions. He didn't have enough direct contact with the troops, so some of his later decisions were not based on military fact. However, if you look at the big picture, I am convinced that he was a great military leader. At the end of the trial, Jodl was found guilty on all accounts. He was mainly found guilty of planning wars of aggression. The verdict specifically mentions the plans to attack Norway, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Russia. His diary, documents, and witness statements were used against him. The Commissar order, which was already part of the initial order to invade the Soviet Union, was also used against him. However, the verdict was controversial. The French judge considered it to be a mistake. Jodl asked for death by firing squad, but this was denied. Instead, he was hanged like all others. Finishing words. There is one quote of Jodl in Gilbert's book that made quite the impression on me. When talking about the crimes of the Nazi regime, he said, "Yes, it is bitter and no fun to be torn apart by the disgust about these dirty events and the natural patriotic feelings that still remain within me. I bet that many German patriots and nationalists feel the same about this even today. Some choose the easy way and just claim that these crimes never happened, or they try to relativize them somehow, while others choose the hard way of acceptance and taking responsibility. In that regard, big politics isn't that much different from private lives." The question regarding Alfred Jodl is how everyone feels about the verdict. There is a wide range of opinions, starting from the extreme left that would have hanged all defendants and ending with the extreme right, which claims the Germans never did anything bad and that the enemies were much worse. I don't consider myself a member of either extreme. I'm a pragmatist and I try to use fact to come to conclusions. Jodl's case isn't the easiest, but I think it's possible to come to reasonable conclusions nonetheless. Question: was Alfred Jodl a Nazi? In my opinion, no, he wasn't. His heritage, marriage, and career clearly show a man that lived in the conservative spectrum of society. Bourgeoisie, nobility, military, that was his world. Sure, that world had some overlaps with the Nazi world, but there were also dividing things. I am sure that Jodl had no problem with the Nazis when it came to militarism and imperialism. However, their racism and their revolutionary attitude were probably not to his taste. However, not being a Nazi doesn't make one innocent. Question: was Alfred Jodl an assistant of the Nazis? Definitely yes. When the Nazis took power, he was a major in the Reichswehr ministry. 5 years later, he was the second man in the Wehrmacht High Command and about to be promoted to Major General. His career, which had progressed at a normal pace before, had accelerated significantly. And why? Because his personality was more compatible with Hitler's. After the Blomberg-Fritsch affair, soldiers opposing Hitler's plans of expansion were removed. Those that replaced them were willing helpers. Keitel is the poster boy for this kind of soldier. However, it seems that Jodl was only marginally different. People that knew him describe him as a simple, hard-working man that kept his opinion to himself, kept quiet when superiors were in the same room, but defended their line when subordinates challenged them, like for example General Guderian. Groveling upwards, kicking downwards was a motto from Imperial Germany, and it seems Alfred Jodl lived by it his entire life. However, being a helper of the Nazis alone doesn't make you guilty. Question: what was Alfred Jodl's attitude towards Hitler? Apparently, rather submissive. Until the very end, he was of the opinion that Hitler was a great military leader. He only criticized him when military operations failed. He didn't comment on Hitler, the politician. However, is it possible to not have known about so many things when one is second man of the Wehrmacht High Command, while ordinary people, far away from the front lines, had partial knowledge of the Holocaust and war crimes? That can only be explained by the head-in-the-sand method. Granted, I believe that Jodl didn't know all the details, but knowing nothing, with all actions of SS and SD behind the front lines, with all the trains that were reserved for the SS and were unavailable for Wehrmacht supplies, not believable. Question: did Jodl do the things he was accused of? Again, definitely yes. By planning campaigns against other countries, 2 of the 4 indictments are already true. It was possible to refuse participating in that, as officers like Blomberg, Fritsch and Beck proved. However, one has to be prepared to make this step, stepping down. Jodl wasn't ready for that, and instead formed a Faustian pact with the Nazis, connecting their fate with his own. Orders signed by him, like the Commissar Order and the Commando Order, were war crimes since they violated the Hague Convention and the Geneva Convention. And his order to deport the population of northern Norway also violates the Hague Convention, and since civilians were affected, it is a crime against humanity. I do believe that these orders probably weren't Jodl's idea and that he just transformed Hitler's spoken orders into written orders, but does that really make a difference? I don't think so. Again, you can refuse to participate, like Colonel General Beck. You don't even have to openly oppose. Jodl could have asked for a frontline command and his replacement at the Wehrmacht High Command, but he didn't. Instead, he did everything Hitler asked him to do, no matter what it was. The fact that people around him mentioned his efforts regarding the Geneva Convention makes me speechless. So he knew exactly what he was ordering, and he did it anyway. Therefore, he is guilty. Question: was the death sentence justified? That's the most difficult question, and I'm struggling with it. Many people in the Third Reich were guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. That starts at the top of the chain of command, when a criminal order is given, and ends at the bottom, where these orders are carried out. In my opinion, the one ordering a crime bears a greater responsibility than the one executing the order, especially when there are differences in age and experience. Alfred Jodl, a man in his 50s with life experience in peace and war, knew exactly what he was ordering. However, he was also one of the first to be indicted at Nuremberg. Later trials were a lot more lenient with their verdicts. Frontline commanders that had given criminal orders, sometimes on their own initiative, just received a few years in prison or nothing at all. It's this imbalance and inequality regarding Jodl's death sentence that troubles me. Were his crimes really that much worse than those of frontline commanders that gave criminal orders as well? Helping the Nazis, worshipping Hitler as a great military leader, and knowing of crimes is, in my opinion, not enough for a death sentence. I think criminal actions are required for this. So if Jodl's actions were sufficient for a death sentence, why were so many others spared? Honestly, I don't have a final opinion on this. Many other Nuremberg cases are much easier. If Jodl had been convicted to life imprisonment, I think this would have been acceptable as well. If you compare his life and career with that of someone like Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, I cannot see any balance or equality regarding verdicts. This may be a controversial comment from my side, however, I stress again, this is not about condemnation or glorification or trivialization. When Alfred Jodl was put on trial, Alfred Jodl was on trial, not everything the Nazis as a whole had ever done. There is no collective punishment in a trial, only individual verdicts, and those have to be justified by the actions of those individuals. And I'm just not certain that the death sentence is justified when I look at Alfred Jodl's actions. When it comes to others, their verdict is much easier to justify, to understand and to support, as we will see at some point. However, everyone should form their own opinion on this and be allowed to defend it. And as long as these opinions are based on fact and not ideology, I have no problem even if those opinions contradict my own. As long as one can talk in a civilized manner, people can accept different opinions. Thank you for your interest.